Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, and welcome to the Mad in America podcast. I'm Javier Rizzo, a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and a science news writer for the Mad in America website. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Mick Cooper to talk about his work on the intersection of psychology and progressive politics, especially how principles in psychotherapy and counseling can contribute to positive social change for all. Mick Cooper is a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Roehampton in the UK. He is a research active practitioner focused on the interface between psychotherapeutic and social and political change, and an active member in the Therapy and Social Network, or TaSC. He is currently working on empirical research focused on client preferences in therapy, shared decision-making and goals, and overall humanistic and existential therapies. Mick is a co-developer of the pluralistic approach to therapeutic practice and is also the acting director of the Center for Research in Psychological Wellbeing, or CREW. He is an author and editor of multiple books on person-centered, existential, and pluralistic approaches to counseling, psychotherapy, and well-being, and recently published his book, Psychology at the Heart of Social Change: Developing a Progressive Vision for Society. So thank you so much, Mick, for joining us today on the podcast.
Thanks, Javier. It's lovely to be here.
So I really want to just, talk about all of these different areas that you've been working in. And I know for some people, they might see these as, just really different areas. And I'd be curious to hear more about your journey to where you are now and how you got interested in all these areas and how you see them all connected to each other.
I started as a young person, came from a progressive background that really focused on, and my parents were both quite involved politically around issues of social justice and questions about how we create a more fair, just society, one in which everybody has a chance, one in which rights and freedoms aren't just for a privileged few. And I guess that was really important for me as I grew up as a young person. And although I kind of differed with my parents' politics as I grew up, to some extent, it was a kind of a bit of a variation on the theme, I guess you could say. And when I went to university, I wanted to do something that would make a social contribution, and was interested in psychology, and moved into the world of counseling and counseling psychology. But I think in that work and in working with people on a one-to-one level, those social justice concerns were still very much integrated into practice. So I was drawn towards person-centered and humanistic ways of working. And I guess particularly person-centered because it really emphasized the value of the client and the client's voice. It questioned the authority and the dominance of the clinician as the expert or the sole expert in the work, and really tried to privilege listening to what clients thought and to take very seriously clients' own abilities to address their problems rather than seeing things in a more hierarchical way. So some of the work that I did around areas like relational depth and developing person-centered therapies was and existential therapies was all based around the idea of a more collaborative, non-hierarchical relationship. And maybe we'll come back to different elements here that prioritize the voice of the client. So in my practice and in my writing around therapy, I wanted to voice and found ways of voicing those social justice elements. But I think there was also something for me broader than that we live in a world in which there are major social justice concerns and questions and inequalities and marginalizations. And therefore, as well as thinking about how in the psychological field we might address that, I think really at the core, and when I was going through some kind of crisis for myself and thinking about what I really want to say while I'm kind of still here, so to speak, while I still can. I was really clear, I think, or it came to me that I wanted to say something about how the work that I've been involved in psychology and in therapy and in counseling psychology might also have a potential to contribute towards a more socially just, caring, cooperative world as a whole. And I think for me, still, that is something that I am deeply, deeply passionate about. That what I care about is not just what happens in the psychological field. I think those issues are enormously important. Mental health treatment, psychiatric institutions, psychiatric treatment, psychological, psychotherapeutic treatment. Most of my research is still in those areas. But, I read the news every day. I look at what's going on from the wildfires that are going on in America at the moment, to the Middle East, to Ukrainian war, to the poverty that we have in the UK and many other parts of the world, to the vast levels of inequity that exist between a very small number of very rich people and much larger numbers of people who are struggling. And so my question about how can all the work that we do in the therapeutic field contribute something there remains really key. And I think in my latest book, the one Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, it was really an attempt to try and articulate what I genuinely see as possibilities, what I genuinely see as possible ways that psychological discourse and understanding, and work, particularly from the humanistic field, the field that I've always been most involved in, like you say, the work of Carl Rogers, really does have a contribution to make that's complex and nuanced, and by no means the only thing that needs to happen. I mean, economic change and political change and change at so many different levels is all enormously important. But I think therapy does have some important part of that I'm sure we'll go on to talk to. So I do see my work is very coherent as a kind of journey through bringing in social justice concerns and a mindset into the therapeutic world. And then carrying on to think about how the therapeutic world can then contribute to wider social justice issues. I think a lot of people in the therapeutic field and in the psychology, psychiatry field are very concerned about social justice issues, and there is a lot of threads of social justice concerns, but I think often we can become so focused on the day-to-day work, which is enormously important, but the day-to-day clinical work, that we can lose maybe some of those wider questions. And I really wanted to try within my career, which I see is kind of beginning to wind down, maybe not, but I wanted to say something and do something before it all ended.
Totally. And you were talking about seeing the possibility in progressive politics of how psychology and psychotherapy can contribute. And I wonder about when you started this journey, how you really got involved in sort of the humanistic world of psychology, considering it's maybe in some ways it's mainstream, but some ways it's quite marginalized, I think, in the psychotherapy world. So I'm curious about how you found that space.
Well, when I was an undergraduate student, I read the work of Carl Rogers. And Rogers, for people who don't know, was an American psychologist writing mainly in the 50s and the 60s, one of the founders of the humanistic psychology movement. His work was one of the first to deviate from a very expert-led model of psychology and to emphasize the strengths, the knowledge, the wisdom that clients themselves have. And he developed what he described as a non-directive approach to therapy in the 40s, and went on to write about client-centered therapy. And actually, in his later work, became very involved in things like the peace movement and mediation and groups, where he tried to bring together people with very different views, say in Northern Ireland, to find ways of having dialogues. And I, as an undergraduate student, I was massively moved by reading his work. I think it was partly the way that he challenged the power of the professionals and emphasized the wisdom of clients and clients' abilities to understand and address their problems. So so there was that kind of humility, and I think that humility was really important for me in that work. But also, I think what I found in Rogers was that he emphasizes a lot of his model is around people being true to themselves and a sense of authenticity, and the idea that we are kind of good enough as we are, that we often wear masks and we present ourselves in a way to the world that is also often a kind of persona that doesn't often reflect what is true underneath. And I guess like a lot of, people in their early 20s, there was like, wow, that is really true, So at a personal level, it really meant a lot to me. And I guess the two ideas intertwine in the sense that when we really value people, then we value them in terms of Rogers talks about unconditional positive regard is one of his key tenets about therapeutic practice is an unconditional acceptance. And that unconditional acceptance of clients, of the people that we work with, of ourselves is a way of kind of expressing that every person is of value. That there's not better or worse people. People may have specialities and knowledge in different areas, but actually that we all have something really fundamental to offer. And for me, that was an expression of the politics that I grew up with, but it was a psychological expression of it. And actually, what I found, and why I was saying earlier about differing with my parents, what I found, and my parents were quite radical in their politics. But I also felt there was something of a contradiction between a kind of radical left-wing politics that was on the one hand saying everybody's equal and people are fundamentally the same and no one's better than the other. But at the same time, there was a kind of a very deep judgment about people who saw things in different ways or people who were trying to do different things, that the kind of sense of equality at some level felt it was certainly, a suggestion at the economic level, but at the psychological level, there was less of a sense of really deeply valuing everybody the same. So I guess I found that in Rogers, and I found that in the humanistic movement, that there was what I guess for me was a kind of deeper progressivism, if you can say that, a deeper progressivism that was really about fundamentally accepting people as equals, not just economically as equals, but psychologically as equals, as each having things to offer. And Rogers is interesting. I mean, as you say, that Rogers is both kind of ubiquitous and marginalized. So I think in the therapeutic world, there was a survey, or they've done surveys of psychologists in America, and Rogers has been identified as the most influential of the psychologists, more than people who developed CBT. But I think because his ideas about the importance of the therapeutic relationship, for instance, is so widely spread now, that many people would see that person-centered work as just fundamental to what they do and not particularly special. And I think also that, we've gone on from Rogers in the psychotherapy research field, which I've been very involved in. We know a lot more now about different methods and techniques that can also be really, really valuable to people. And I think personally, Rogers would have really valued that and would have accepted that and wouldn't have wanted people to stay in, kind of what he saw as the effective factors in the 50s and 60s. Now, in the person-centered field itself, and when I was involved in existential field and person-centered field, there were people, and there could be quite I guess what I saw sometimes is quite a dogmatic element, like people saying that, what Carl Rogers said in 1950, or what some of the existential therapists said in around those periods, is the be all and end all. And I think that's one of the reasons why approaches like CBT and third word CBTs like ACT and acceptance commitment therapy and dialectical behavior therapy have been really successful because they've evolved and grown. Whereas paradoxically, the kind of human growth movement, or the humanistic therapies, which emphasize so much growth, actually have a lot of that has stagnated, although there is kind of some more contemporary work now. When we developed pluralistic therapy, it was a way of trying to bring, I guess, in some ways, those humanistic principles up to date into the 21st century. Because what we said in what pluralistic therapy about was the starting point that there's lots of really helpful ways that we can work with people, and that we should try and tailor the therapy to the particular client's wants and needs, and be talking to clients about what it is that they want and need. And in a sense, that was taking those humanistic principles, those client-centered principles of valuing of the client wisdom, but not locking it down into then a set of techniques or methods about how you work with somebody, but recognizing that actually there's lots of different ways to be helpful. And so the kind of pluralistic framework is a really open framework about valuing lots and lots of different methods, from CBT to psychodynamic, to humanistic and existential and person-centered. I'm recognizing that within our own skills and knowledge and expertise, that we can be flexible and collaborative and work with clients to find out what is best for them. That might end up paradoxically involving quite directive methods, but actually that's okay, because some clients want direction. We know from our research, we've done quite a lot of research recently on young people in therapy, and it was clear that a lot of them did want direction and did want guidance, and that's fine. That's and that needs to be listened to and responded to.
You really kind of hone in on the elements of psychotherapy and humanistic psychotherapy that really inspire you and made you see sort of the connection between these values and politics. Your book really kind of starts to talk about the neglect of psychology within progressive politics, but also maybe whether that's also been the inverse as well, that this political vision has sort of been ignored, even within humanistic spaces, maybe, or I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think the States is really leading the way. There's been some really wonderful work in the States around multicultural social justice competencies for decades now. And when I talk to people in the UK, one of the things I do is really encourage them to read, for instance, the multicultural and social justice competencies developed by Rats and people in, I think it's 2015, because in the States, in the counseling field, there are people now talking about multicultural work, social justice work as a fourth, fifth force in psychology. So there's a really important pocket there. The work of Mad in America, and going back through the tradition of Lang, and many people who have questioned the power structures within the psychiatric system, is another area where colleagues of mine like James Davis in the UK have also been very involved in that have had a very political angle to their work in questioning power structures. But I think in mainstream clinical counseling psychology, counseling psychotherapy, I think the political angle is very implicit. I do think it's there. I think it's there in the work I was talking about, Rogers. I think the kind of respect and the emphasis on elements like the alliance and the working relationship, and the recognition of the importance of that relationship, which emphasizes the collaborative nature. I think most of the people that I meet in the psychotherapy, psychology, counseling field do have a basic progressivism in their way of working with clients. But I think the more explicit extension of that into the kind of wider field of practice has been slow and has been, I guess, people, partly because people have had to focus on their jobs. As I was saying earlier, people focus on their jobs, on their work, on making a living. There hasn't been really so much time for people to extend and develop those political elements of their work. Certainly, I mean, you were mentioning at the beginning that we've set up in the UK a therapy and social change network, TaSC. There's been a lot of interest in it. We've had a lot of people very on board with it. We've had good meetings online. We had a conference when the Ukraine war started. We had a conference to raise money to support Ukrainian psychologists. There were many people in the field who were very willing to come forward and support that work and be involved in that work. I certainly wouldn't say there's been a lot of resistance to it. Now, there are some small pockets in the UK. I don't know so much in the States, but certainly in the UK, there have been some small pockets that see this as kind of wokeism gone mad, and that are pushing back and saying, therapy is about providing space for clients. What are you doing telling clients who they should vote for? What are you doing getting politics involved with therapy? They're completely different things. You really shouldn't be talking about this stuff. But I think those voices have been pretty marginal. I'm not sure how much traction they've had. There's been a few books, but I don't get a sense there's a lot of energy for it. I think generally, my sense is that the direction of travel is towards an appreciation and acknowledgement of these social justice issues in therapy, but just people are struggling with the resources to really fully engage with it. I mean, a big issue is around training and trying to bring it more into the training of therapists, counselors, psychologists. The one of the main professional bodies that I'm involved with, the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapists, recently developed some really good competencies and guidelines for working around these issues. And so again, the professional bodies are on board. The UKCP recently had a conference, which is the psychotherapist organisation in the UK, recently had a conference about kind of political issues and, talking about social justice issues. The British Psychological Society, there's an excellent new chair who's really been pushing on this. So it feels like a kind of open door that a lot of people want to develop and understand and explore these links more. But having the time to do it, having a look at what it means. And I think also, maybe we'll come on to this, Javier, is kind of trying to develop more of an understanding of some of the complexities beyond just we need to take these issues seriously, but what we do, how we do that. Issues, for instance, like broaching in therapy. There's been in the States, one of the areas of work and research has been around the idea that as a therapist, what you would do is you would invite the client into and say to them something along the lines of, this is a space where we can talk about you being black or you being a woman or you being gay, and that there's an opportunity. You broach these issues. But I think where we need to go next is to be talking also about some of the nuances and some of the complexities about, where that may be not so helpful, where it is more helpful. We need time for that, really. We all need time.
Psychotherapy isn't historically a discipline that really has grappled with the political element so explicitly.
I would challenge that a little bit. I think that if you go back and you look at people like Adler and you look at people like Reich, people like Eric Berne, who developed transactional analysis, a lot of the people in the psychotherapy field were very progressive and were, Adler's work, for instance, was a lot about social justice and how we create a more socially just society. There's been a journal, Psychotherapy and Politics International, that's been going for many years. There's, all the work that you're doing and that Mad in America does. As I was saying, going back to people like Ronnie Lang, who introduced and brought together the psychological, psychiatric, and the political. So I think you're right that it maybe hasn't been the main thrust of it, but I think that there are some really important threads. There's a whole area of liberation psychologies emerging, community psychology. I think there's a lot of different groups and different voices that are trying to link together the field of therapy, psychology, psychiatry, and social justice. So I feel, quite optimistic about I don't feel optimistic about much at the moment, but that is one area that I do have some optimism about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're right. There are strains of this that have been going back even from its beginnings. I can imagine even Freud having something to say about this too, right? We've been talking about psychotherapy as a field, but also just like really the principles that you're really seeing as being so applicable to social change and progressive social change. I wonder if you can just speak to some of those elements, and especially as you sort of talk about the world on fire, how you might see some of these principles and practices that we often use as therapists, and how those might actually be implemented in our real world.
So I was talking earlier about unconditional positive regard, and I think maybe the phrase radical acceptance would summarize it most deeply. I think that what we can take from the therapeutic world is the knowledge and the skills in developing ways of relating to each other in the macro, the wider social level, that have a radical acceptance of others. That means having a politics which is not about shaming others, criticizing others, putting others down, but is about valuing others. That is about teaching kids from a very early age. I mean, we have social and emotional learning programs that are really well evidenced, and rolling those out in a way that means that children from the youngest age can learn to listen to others, to empathize with others, to understand what others are feeling as well as what their own feelings are, so that they can grow into adults who can accept and understand and engage and dialogue with others in peaceful, cooperative, caring ways. And that's not to say, I mean, a standpoint of radical acceptance is not about saying what anybody does is okay. It's not about saying, if somebody acts in racist ways or homophobic ways or is violent towards others, that's okay. But it's a standpoint which recognizes the inherent humanity of each person. It's very rare that people do things to be bad. I mean, people can certainly do things that are bad and very antisocial and very destructive towards others. But I think that we know that as a therapist, what we learn when we work with clients who can behave in self-destructive, rather destructive ways, that it's often it's a way of striving towards their own needs and wants that are often because of frustrations or difficulties or challenges that they've experienced in their life, that the way that they do that is harmful. So I think radical acceptance comes from the place of recognizing that each human being ultimately, the things that they're striving for, what their most fundamental directions are, whether it's for relatedness, self-worth, meaning, pleasure, are shared across humanity. That they're not. We don't have an inherent evil, and from that, developing the skills then to engage with people that can recognize, meet, dialogue with the humanity in others, and that leads to the potential for creating a world that can then be more cooperative, more collaborative, where more people can have more of what they want more of the time. You know that, one of the things I talk about in my book is game theory. Game theory is about the interconnectedness, about how you work in systems that are fundamentally interconnected. And when we look at things like climate change, we're existing on a planet where we are fundamentally interconnected. You can't have a nation. Well, you can have a nation saying, "I'm just going to do what we want around climate control and oil coal production," but that it impacts on everybody else and leads to vicious, destructive cycles. So, developing those higher skills where we're able to cooperate together is where I think psychology can help us and help create a more thriving planet, a planet that is based on the politics of understanding rather than a politics of blame and demonization. But I think where that starts from, as I was saying, is that it starts from developing, for all of us really, developing a mindset of radical acceptance. Radical acceptance, a radical understanding of the humanity and the value of the other, which goes back really for me, goes back to my earliest kind of political learning. I guess in a way, where my book was angled at, the book, The Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, was specifically angled at progressives. And what it was kind of saying is that a progressive politics, which is based on blame and demonization and we're right and you're wrong, is ultimately a contradiction in terms and is ultimately self-defeating, because it's not genuinely viewing the other as equal. It's not genuinely respecting others. And if we want to create a world which is about respecting others, if we want to create a politic which is based on respect and empathy and understanding, we kind of have to make the first step. We have to start. When you look at the kind of theories and the research about what human beings fundamentally need, one of the commonalities across nearly all the models is around relatedness and connectedness, that as human beings, we have such a fundamental need to be in connection with others, to be in closeness with others, to be together with others, not just kind of in the sense of security, but in the sense of interaction and engagement. And people are happiest, for instance, when they're engaging with others, that when people have good, close, intimate relationships, they're less depressed, they're less anxious. Even the health benefits of good relationships is astounding. The research shows what a difference it makes. So I think people, in so many ways, are striving for connectedness with others. But often, I guess, the ways that we do that, for instance, through competitiveness, through trying to prove that we're better, end up being self-defeating and kind of indirect. And part of the book is around psychologically that we often become very entangled in ways of trying to get what we want. And in therapy, what you do in therapy is often you're helping people to understand what it is that they really want, and then you're helping them think about the ways that they could get there most effectively. And often it's about untangling the kind of things people do that they do for reasons. They might do for legitimate reasons, but actually end up being self-defeating. So, for instance, somebody might really want closeness and intimacy with others, but they're also really afraid of being hurt, perhaps because they've been hurt in past relationships. And so they keep others at an arm's length. They don't allow themselves to let go with others. They don't show their emotions. As a therapist, you recognize the intelligibility of that as language. So you recognize that there's a reason why they're protecting themselves, but you also invite them to think about other things that they could do, and you provide a space in which they can work out for themselves, or you, through dialogue, that they maybe recognize that they can give trusting, try out trusting, see what happens, maybe do it step by step. maybe allow people in a little bit, see if that feels okay, maybe allow people in a little bit more. So in the same way that in therapy, I guess what you're doing is you're helping people kind of recognize those deeper relational needs. And often so much of therapy, I think, is about helping people recognize and connect with those relational needs. And the therapeutic work itself is often about those relational needs. Then I think politically, we can also think about how we can help as a society um, achieve and meet the relational needs that so many of us have. What can we do as a society that can cultivate those relational needs? I think people have many different needs, and certainly we don't only have relational needs, but one of the things I talk about in the book is around synergies, and that things are good when they allow lots of people to achieve their goals together rather than against each other. And whereas kind of needs for maybe freedom or self-esteem can tend to pull more away from each other, there's a wonderful synergy that you get with relational needs, love needs, which can be, where one person's achievement of what they want can also facilitate what somebody else wants. The more that one person can feel close, the more another person can feel close. There's so much potential there in relationality. So I think where I came to in my book is really that relationality, relational depth, which means that close connection really between people, holds so much promise for a society. And I think the more that we can orientate around a society around those relational and those connecting needs, rather than say individualistic needs for self-esteem, the more that we can create society where more people can have more of their needs met, because that offers so much potential.
I hear you that, this relationality is a huge part of this, vision for a more egalitarian society, and can't help but think about some of the challenges in doing this kind of relational work. There's so many different, I guess, avenues where this happens, but you think about it with, climate change, and despite, how do we get people to motivate them to have these dialogues, right? Because it's assuming that there's a space for dialogue. And when you have such, deep investments in not having that dialogue, how do you even get people to that point?
Colleague of mine, Kurt Schneider, in the States, who's in the existential humanistic field, is creating these dialogues, bringing together people from different positions to talk to each other. And I think that kind of work of bringing people into dialogue is really important. How do you do it? I think that partly the reason that people don't come into dialogue is also around people feeling that they're not going to be heard, that they're going to be shamed, that they're not going to be respected. I think if from a progressive standpoint, we can convey and embody a empathic stance towards others, and people can feel that that's going to come, rather than things like, people talk about things like cancel culture. And I really understand that, that sometimes you don't want to hear things because they're so offensive. But at the same time, those kind of ways of responding to others can make people feel more defensive and make people feel that there's not going to be a space for them to talk. At the end of the day, this is maybe a controversial thing to say, but the Musks and the Trumps of the world, however much at a personal level, I look at their behaviors and I'm horrified. Deep down, I do believe they're human beings like the rest of us, that they have needs for closeness, that they have needs for self-esteem, that they have needs for kind of material needs as well, but not just material needs, that needs to be heard. And I think perhaps if progressives can take a lead in creating cultures where people can feel that they are going to be heard, and where those other elements of them are also going to be respected and seen. If they feel that they're going to be shamed, people feel that they're going to be shamed, and there's so much shame in public discourse, on Twitter and X, and so much of that it propels people away from each other. And it's certainly it's not an easy solution, and I wish there was. I feel desperate for a need for an easy solution because time feels so pressing. Like you say, around climate change. I mean, the latest figures around where world temperatures are getting to is just, I find that personally just terrifying. So there is a real urgency, but I think if that catalyzes more blame and more criticism, I just suspect that's going to be counterproductive. I think there needs to be clear boundaries, clear demands, clear expectations. But I think if that can be done in parallel with the development, the education, the learning of a culture of empathy, understanding, acceptance, that gives us, I think, the most leverage to be able to create the kind of world that so many of us want to live in, which is a more compassionate world. Somehow there's something about, if we want to create a compassionate, empathic world, we can't do that through means that aren't compassionate, empathic themselves. It creates more discord and creates more antagonism.
Yeah, like really kind of hoping to instill these values of really kind of inviting the other in and really trying to understand. And it's clear to me how psychotherapy really embodies that as a practice. And so I really do hope that more people can really understand these principles a bit more, and maybe they experience them in their own psychotherapy and try to radiate that outwards in their lives, or other therapists for that matter, really kind of engaging in more social work in that way. People who are interested, whether they're therapists, whether they're clients themselves, or people who have who are just interested in what you're talking about, what are ways that they can engage with this more and engage with your work?
Yeah, thanks, Javier. I mean, there's the Therapy and Social Change Network that we'll put the link to, and there's lots of seminars and discussions there, and we have links to work in America. I would really encourage people to look at the work of, for instance, the multicultural competencies and work that's been done in the States around bringing these kind of social justice issues into therapy. There's obviously the work in Mad in America and the many kind of different organizations that are kind of raising issues about the power relationships in psychiatry, and they are really great starting places for looking at these issues. There's the work of Michael Lerner in the States, who's done some really interesting, I think similar to myself, also talking about kind of radical acceptance in politics is really interesting. I think that, I mean, what we're finding in the UK is that groups are kind of starting up and people are beginning to talk more, and it is at really early stages. And I think some of the questions you're asking, Javier, about, for instance, you were asking or raising the issue about how do you bring people with power to the table, and what that makes me think about is that there's still so much of these kinds of issues that need thinking about. The honest truth is, I wish I had a much better answer to you for those kinds of questions. But I think part of a kind of more emotionally literate politics and a different way of thinking about political issues is about kind of acknowledging when we don't know things, and acknowledging that some of these things really don't have easy answers, and then coming together to be able to think about how we might take it forward. So I don't think my sense is we're not at a point where there's lots of groups out there who are kind of really have clear agendas taking these kind of questions forward. I think we're still at very formative stages, and I wish that we were much further forward. But I guess the reality is we can't rush it, and we have to go at the pace that we need to go at. To be exploring these issues and to be trying to develop a different kind of culture, because a culture of acceptance and a culture of radical acceptance isn't going to come through forcing it, through criticizing ourselves or feeling that we're going too slow and things aren't good enough. It's just like in therapy, really. somebody can't beat themselves into self-acceptance. It's something that comes often gradually and gently in different layers and different waves, and often comes from accepting in a way that you don't accept yourself. Often that's the first step, is going, that we're at this really early stage where even that, it's okay not to always be compassionate about yourself. So it is a slow process. And I just really encourage people to, maybe go to the TaSC website, look at what's going on, think about getting more involved, thinking about, we desperately need people taking more kind of leadership roles and being more actively involved in these kinds of questions, and bringing these insights from psychology, psychiatry into wider social justice questions.
Mick, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Javier.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.